Hi, everyone. Welcome to Identity Crisis, a show about news and ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer, president of Shalom Hartman Institute North America. We're recording today on April 30th, 2020, which is the day after Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. And that's going to be our topic for today. It's okay that we're recording not on Israeli Independence Day, but on the day after, because I'm recording from here in the Diaspora where we keep 2 days of holidays. So we'll do the same for the purposes of Israeli Independence Day as well. Today, I'm joined by Rabbat Sigalit Ur, a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel and a PhD candidate at Tel Aviv University, who's joining us from Israel. And we're going to be excited to hear from you, Sigalit, about the strange experience of Yom HaAtzmaut this year, as opposed to all other years. And I'm also joined by Dr. Tomer Persico, who is the Shalom Hartman Institute's Bay Area Scholar in Residence and the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor at the Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at Berkeley. And you too, Tomer, celebrating a strange Yom HaAtzmaut in two types of displacedness, one from Israel and very far away, and also this weird experience of celebrating our holidays while sheltering at home. So first of all, thanks to both of you for being here. And let me just start by asking you something great that you've read, watched, eaten, or cooked in the last couple of weeks, or maybe specifically for Yom HaAtzmaut. Sigalit, I want to start with you.
Okay. Well, I have to say, Yom HaAtzmaut usually is a day where I'm very busy, so I don't have time to watch TV to see the regular sort of very formal events that Israel puts on for Yom HaAtzmaut, from the lighting of the masuot, the torches, the first night, to the Israel prizes the second night. But last night, and indeed the whole day, there wasn't that much to do. So I did find myself watching here and there, and including watching the granting of the Israel prizes just at the end of the holiday. And Vered Noam, Professor Vered Noam, who's my professor of Talmud, is the first woman who won a prize for Talmudic studies, and it made me and many people very, very happy. So that made my day.
Yeah, that's really special. Actually, yesterday on a podcast that we did at Hartman, Daniel Hartman was on the podcast as well, a webinar that we did with JFNA. And he said he was surprised this year, unlike other years, by the tone around the torches, the diversity that was actually reflected in Israeli society, the language of collective obligation, and said it was kind of unusual and different. So maybe we can come back to that a little bit later and ask whether there is a kind of tone change in Israeli society right now. Tomer, how about you? What have you been reading, watching, eating, or cooking these days?
Well, I'm trying to use the seclusion at home to catch up on some non-scholarly works and read. And I've read The Merchant of Venice. I'm trying to read some classics. I'm reading Shakespeare, and I've read it for the first time. And you know, I'm quite. It's amazing the amount of actually anti-Semitism that there's there. Right? I mean, with the whole Shylock's famous speech about has not a Jew hands and etc. I mean, the main motive of the play is not pro-Jewish, let's say. So, but I mean, it was an experience reading it at home in Berkeley.
I love that. So on our end, I was debating whether the right thing to do as an American Jew celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut is to cook what Israelis would cook for Yom HaAtzmaut, which is to barbecue, or to cook what American Jews think that Israelis do on Yom HaAtzmaut, which is to make falafel. So I decided in the end to go with the barbecuing. And the real hero of the cooking last night, was making homemade pita for the first time, which was surprisingly easy and grillable, and came out pretty good. So I tend to divide the world between people who cook and people who bake, and I'm definitely on team cook and not baking. It's just too orderly, the whole baking thing. So this felt like something I could bake, but I could be cooking at the same time. So Chag Sameach to both of you. Happy Yom HaAtzmaut. I'm sure it's a day that evokes for both of you as Israelis all sorts of complicated emotions. Maybe Sigalit, you could tell us a little bit about what Yom HaAtzmaut was like in Israel this year. You said you were less busy this year than less running around, fewer tiyulim. And of course, this is one of those days, Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, also is the day of pilgrimage to grave sites. And it has always felt to me when I'm there and from afar, a day of the Israeli public square in all sorts of ways. So what did it feel like this year to be observing these days in a totally different set of situations?
Well, it's a period in Israel every year where there's a glut of ceremonies. Last week, ceremonies for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Remembrance Day. This week for Yom HaZikaron. In recent years, there are two ceremonies for Yom HaZikaron, the first on the eve of Yom HaZikaron and the second sort of to mark the transition between Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. And since I live in a small village in the Galilee, we also have a tradition where on Yom HaZikaron in the afternoon, we take all the village, kids and adults and elderly people and so on, and we go on a hike to a site where some battles or you know, some kind of historical event took place. And we hear the story and we have a ceremony there. This year, of course, we couldn't do anything like that. And we had this strange experience of ceremonies by Zoom or by YouTube. Very, very awkward seeing these people that we live across the street from just on the screens, and having these very emotional moments mediated by technology. Really very weird. And then Yom HaAtzmaut itself is, as you mentioned, a day of tiyulim, of hikes and of barbecues, usually very well attended by many people coming from many places around the country. This year there was a curfew on Yom HaAtzmaut to prevent that kind of thing. So we could only socialize, and even then in a very limited way, with the people in our village. And no tiyulim, including, and this really pains me, this is usually the time when I take 2 months off, if I can, from work and just go hike. I always say it's a sin in this springtime in Israel to stay indoors. But this year we had to stay indoors, and we're missing the full Kinneret. For the first time in, I think, maybe 15 years, the Kinneret is reaching its highest level, and we haven't been there to see it. Very sad.
Yeah, I mean, I want to turn to you, Tomer, because I've always found one of the strangest parts of being an American Jew and a Zionist is celebrating these particular holidays, and especially that weird time difference. You actually feel it very intensely when Israelis have already moved on from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut, but American Jews don't know, am I supposed to be keeping Yom HaAtzmaut now or still in Yom HaZikaron time? So you've been living in Berkeley for a couple of years now, and I'm curious, you know, obviously this year is different than other years, but I'd be curious for you to reflect a little bit on what it means for an Israeli in the diaspora to be thinking about and celebrating these holidays.
I mean, you know, this is continuing what you said before, whether we eat Israeli or what we think the Israelis eat. I definitely work by Israeli time. So in Yom HaZikaron, in Memorial Day, I'm depressed when it starts in Israel. And when it's out in Israel, that's when I begin my Yom HaAtzmaut. I'm totally, because also, you know, the today's social media allows you almost completely to be there. I mean, my friends are there, family is there. The radio I can hear from Israelis singing the appropriate tunes for your requested mood. So I'm completely there. And in that way, the fact that we're now in a sort of a social seclusion, etc., didn't really mean a lot for me, since anyway, it's not like I would have gone and hiked or barbecued with friends. Here, maybe, maybe symbolically meeting a few Israelis that are around here, but not really. So, I'm basically following what's happening in Israel and adjusting my mood accordingly.
I have to say, I had kind of the opposite experience, because I now have a daughter who's living in Maryland. She's a shlicha for the Sochnut, an emissary. And she invited me to join the community Hallel that she was leading with Israeli tunes in Maryland. So on Yom HaAtzmaut afternoon, Israel time, I went to join the morning Maryland Hallel for Yom HaAtzmaut, and found it to be a very disorienting experience. I wasn't really sure what that had to do with the people in Maryland's experience, especially in this year. Was it relevant in any way to where they are right now?
Wait, why do you mean it was disorienting? Because, like, what about it felt disorienting to you?
you know, there's a big, there used to be a big argument in Israel whether to do Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, yes or no. And it's, you know, it's a dividing line between the Zionist synagogues who do Hallel, some of them even with a bracha and some of them without, and the Haredi ones who don't. But Hallel is a very Israeli thing to do. And especially with the version with the Israeli tunes, it seems to me that nowadays with everybody hunkering down in the Corona time, Hallel celebrating Israel's birthday in Maryland, how relevant is that? I mean, there are so many more burning concerns over there. It almost felt uncomfortable to have my daughter sort of convening people to celebrate Israel's birthday when I'm sure they have more pressing concerns over there.
That's an interesting insight. I mean, I guess the internal logic of it is either you treat these holidays as having religious significance. If that's your orientation as a Zionist, is to view these as moments in Jewish history that rise to the level of other holidays, then if you do, then you do Hallel and you say prayers and you use God's name to consecrate the days, or you don't. But I don't know why it would necessarily be the case that, like, when I don't have Israel on my mind so much, I don't say Hallel, because that would feel like a way of saying, okay, this year I couldn't be with my family for Passover, so I guess I'm not doing Seder anymore. Right? Either it's part of the liturgical year or not. And I, you know, Tomer, you and I have talked about this a little bit over the years since you've been in Berkeley as well, of your own experience as a Zionist feeling quite different, not actually living in Israel. I think this is the first time you've lived outside of Israel. So I wonder if what your take is on that experience of American Jews celebrating or not celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut, and what feels different for you as an Israeli in Israel versus not being in Israel.
I mean, what feels differently is simply the very practical things that I can't go out and celebrate. My wife just reminded me that our third date 10 years ago was in Yom Ha'atzmaut, and we went together to Shuk Machne Yehuda, to the Machne Yehuda market, and every Yom Ha'atzmaut, not this Yom Ha'atzmaut, I guess, but every Yom Ha'atzmaut there's simply a fair or a humongous street party there, and we joined the people there, and you know, the fireworks and the whole thing. So I mean, really, it's less an ideal and an ideational sort of difference for me, and more a practical, where am I going and who am I celebrating with? Being here is different in a way that if at all, simply it's seeing a different way to be a Jew. Really, it's just seeing the whole national identity from afar and being able maybe to reflect about it. But this is the whole year long, and Yom Ha'atzmaut maybe a bit accentuates it, but really it's a different experience that way.
Does it feel like a religious holiday to you? Apropos Sigalit's comment?
No, I don't think so. No, it's just, for me, it's just a time to be happy that we are living in such a blessed era, that we have this as Jews. It's really just being thankful for that.
What about you, Sigali? You said it felt strange for Jews in Maryland to be focused on this story and to be kind of saying God's name in prayer around Yom Ha'atzmaut. And I'm curious now on the other side, like, why would it feel less weird to do that as an Israeli among Israelis? And I would also put you on the spot, is it a religious holiday for you?
Well, when I was a kid, I said the Tfilah L'Shlom Medina, the prayer for the state of Israel, you know, with Israel as the first flowering of our redemption, with a whole heart. Nowadays, I don't really do that. I use the conservative movement's version, which sort of has dropped that. Or if I'm in an Orthodox synagogue and they say, an Orthodox Zionist one, and they say the regular one, then I say, Sheteheh, may it be the first flowering of our redemption. And that, I guess, stems from some of my disappointments as to how the dreams of the first Zionists sort of turned out. I see a lot of failure. Even in the day after Yom Ha'atzmaut, I still see that the first Zionists had very high standards, and we don't really stand up to them. So does it have religious experience? Much less, I think. More for the potential than for the actuality.
Yeah, I suppose I identify with some of that too. At an earlier time in my life, I was like a poster child for American religious Zionism, and I've been much more ambivalent about it ever since because of my awareness. It's not just about disappointment, but it's also about the politics that seem to travel almost inevitably with religious Zionism, and the difficulty that it can feel, the incompatibility of being politically left and still identified with that camp. I guess the place that I've come out, and it shouldn't be that surprising, all of us are one way or another affiliated with the Hartman Institute, but David Hartman has a powerful distinction that he draws between what he calls the ethics of description and the ethics of response about the question of God in history, where he says, I would not have the hubris to say, to try to describe God acting in history. I have no idea whether or not God intervenes to create the state of Israel. And partly he says that because if you make the claim that God is acting in history on behalf of the state of Israel, you have to come up with some really shallow explanation of how God acts in history with respect to the Shoah, the Holocaust. He says, I make no empirical description about God in history. All I ask myself is, as a religious person, what is my response to the changing face of history supposed to look like? So in other words, I don't want to say anything affirmative about God, but I do want to say something affirmative as a religious person. But I guess, the whole debate on whether it's a holiday aside, I also have just struck that, and I find this for myself, I'm curious for both of you, given your politics and given your voice. I know, especially Tomer, you are a widely known political commentator in Israel. And I've always found that Yom Ha'atzmaut is the one day of the year where I, as a liberal Zionist, oftentimes critical of the state of Israel, just want to have like a day to celebrate it. So actually, it's very secularity as being just a day of celebration is in some ways also a kind of way out of that. Of like, yeah, we'll argue tomorrow about how it's doing, but today it's just basically a day for celebration.
That's exactly how I feel, and I felt for many years. I have to say, this year it's a bit different. I feel with the whole 3 elections in the past year behind us, just behind us, and the new government trying to be formed by changing actually basic laws and actually nitty-gritty of the structure of Israeli governance. That's what they're doing. I'm a bit more, I don't know, a bit less only festive and a bit more critical with what's happening now in Israel. So it's been also, in that account, a bit harder for me. I mean, I have to say it's not only a religious thing. Also, responding to Sigalit, I come from a secular house, and I certainly never bought into or believed in the messianic sort of promise of being in a redemptive age or something like that. But even in a general Zionist perception, Zionism was always not only about building a home, a secure home, or a national home for the Jews in Israel. It was always also about building a model society, a just society, a society and a state which we can be proud of as an exemplary state, a sort of a secularization of the Or LaGoyim, the light to the nation. So in that account, I have to join Sigalit and you maybe with a bit disappointment and the hope that that we are still not too late to fulfill that promise.
I think something that really put it in a nutshell was a piece that was put out right on Motzei Yom Ha'atzmaut, right after, as we were all sort of celebrating the one day where we celebrate without reservation. They put out this preview of a satirical show called Yehudim Ba'im, the Jews are coming. And it's a parody of a song from the 90s that had an army group singing about their disappointment of the fact that their parents promised that they would have peace and there still isn't peace. So this parody was about the kids of the kids singing about not just their disappointment that there still isn't peace, but their disappointment that the only promises that they're getting, never mind that the promises aren't being fulfilled, but the promises themselves have just become, it's going to be, kind of okay. You know,
We'll survive.
Just the difference between that, we promise you it's going to be kind of okay, to the big promise, to the big ideals, to the big models that that you read in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, is just painful.
I find as a Zionist and a Zionist who believes that part of what it means to be a Zionist is to be in conversation with Israel's successes and failures. And as someone who believes in the American Jewish community and trying to broaden the tent of legitimate discourse around Israel, at minimum, you should be able to say things in American Jewish communities that can be said in the Israeli Knesset, but oftentimes it's actually narrower in the American Jewish community. One of the places that I would love to see a flourishing of Zionist education in the diaspora is around Israeli comedy, because things like Hayudim Ba'im, Eretz Nehederet, all of these shows have a biting, critical quality, and it's rooted in a paradigm of citizenship. It's rooted in a notion of, yeah, I'm angry and I'm disappointed because it's not the country that I want to be, and there's something deeply liberating about it. It's sad, right? That bit that I saw that you referenced, Igali, it's really sad and funny and scary, but it's also, there's something freeing about the normalcy that comes with a society that actually knows how to do self-criticism. Tomer, you brought a couple of texts for us to read today and to talk about the from Israel's founding, some questions of law, and I want you to lead us a little bit in exploring those together, and hopefully we can use that as a way to talk a little bit about not just Yom HaAtzmaut itself, Israel Independence Day, but the state of the state.
Yeah, I mean, continuing from Yom HaAtzmaut, I want to ask myself, and I ask myself, what really is Israel for? I mean, and I just mentioned that a certain vision that the Zionists had. I mean, a vision not only of a home, but of a model society. It's really an answer to the question, what are we doing here, right? Why are we establishing a new state? What's the purpose? And living in the States, I'm witnessing, I'm engaged with the difference of the different answer that the founding fathers of the United States gave for their project. Why are they founding a new country, right? A new state? What's the purpose of it? And you can actually see this very clearly in the two declarations of independences of the United States and of Israel, right? And it starts really from the very first line. Like if you take the Declaration of Independence of the United States first line, the first line is, when in the course of human events, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you've got the Israeli Declaration of Independence. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. That's the first line. And already from there, you can get that these people are talking about totally different projects. One is a universal, global, humane, humanity-centered project of a new kind of society, a new kind of country, a democracy, an egalitarian, etc. And we know, of course, all the flaws that were already there, but that's the vision, right? That's the pretense. And in Israel, the state of Israel, the vision is different. It is a specific state for a specific people. They have a specific historical connection to that place. They want a specific country to be founded, and that's what they need, right? And you can, and you know, jumping ahead with the texts, you can see that, you know, we all know in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, we all, you know by heart that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and there certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what's the next sentence, right? We stop our rehearsed memory at that point. What's the next sentence? The next sentence is, to secure these rights, governments are founded by men, or established. How is it, right? Governments are instituted among men, right? So it's stated very clearly, we are establishing a government to secure our basic rights. That is the premise. And that comes straight out of John Locke's philosophy. And that's the whole, the whole social contract that the United States is based upon. And again, looking at the Israeli Declaration of Independence, that's not what the state is for. Now, the declaration does say Israel will be open and will be equal and will protect the rights, etc. But it says Israel will have an open immigration for Jews. Israel will forward Jewish settlements over the land, etc., etc. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that the project is establishing a nation state for certain people. And I think actually that many Americans, including American Jews, living in the US and so ingrained and breathing and drinking the US Declaration of Independence and all it represents day and night, have a problem understanding different conceptions of modern nation states that are not this sort of universalistic, humanitarian sort of vision. And in Israel, that's simply not the case.
So I appreciate what you're asking us to do, which is basically to go back to these two countries' moments of founding and to try to identify the mythic narrative that they tell about themselves, and to acknowledge that as a result, they're two stories that are holding themselves accountable by different standards. Israel's story of itself, as you're suggesting, is a nation state to solve for the problems of the Jewish people and rooted in a particular curated historical narrative about that land. We could talk about what's left out of that story, quite obviously. And in some ways, what you're saying is like, I know Israel is not a success story from a universalistic standpoint, but the measure, the yardstick, is merely a success story from whether it's good for the Jewish people's internal narrative about itself. But as I say that out loud, and I'm sympathetic to it, look what problem that creates, right?
No, but I didn't say that. I said, yes, certainly we shouldn't judge Israel by the universal yardstick. Certainly Israel is meant to be something else. By the way, not only meant by its founders, but also recognized by the United Nations and the international community to be something else. Of course, now we need to judge it, but by that yardstick, it still has to be a democracy. It still has to respect equally all its citizens' rights, etc., etc. And now by that yardstick, it's also, I can have some criticism about it, but certainly we shouldn't judge it by the standard of the United States. And I'll give an example. If you look at the founding, Ben-Gurion's and Jabotinsky's writings, you will see there distinct underlining of the necessity for Jews to be a majority between the Jordan and the sea, or for Jabotinsky also Transjordan, etc. And you see that talk about being a majority and needing aliyah and needing millions of Jews to come from Europe. This is before the Holocaust, etc. And in American eyes, this is at the least, uncomfortable and at most simply racist and totally illegitimate, right? Because we need to found a democracy which doesn't concern itself with the ethnicity or nationality of the people, of the citizens, right? That's the United States. You don't care where you come from, right? But here again, it's a different project meant to fulfill different desires, different aspirations, right? And in the context of Israeli nationality, this is perfectly logical and indeed necessary, because what these Zionists wanted to do is not live in a country that gives them rights, gives them equal rights. They can't have that in the US. They wanted to live in a country which gives other people equal rights. They will be the ones that are in charge of equity and democracy, right? And now you can judge if we are successful in that or not. But that's the aspiration, and that's the, I think, totally legitimate project that they were trying to establish.
Sigali, you spoke earlier about what ways Israel feels sometimes that it falls short. And so Tomer is basically laying out a kind of a different construct, which is to say I'm not, of course, telling you there are ways in which you believe that Israel falls short. That's why you do the work that you do. But you're setting up a kind of different benchmark against which that operates. So particularly, how do you read the same texts around the benchmark that the state of Israel establishes for itself, which is Israel as essentially a homeland for Jewish people, and the implied majoritarianism, right? We are meant to be the majority. And yes, of course, we should give equal rights to the minority, but that's the standard around which we're supposed to govern ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was something that is very much accepted as a well-known truth here, and it wasn't even something that I considered problematic in any way. I grew up in the Tel Aviv area, and I was surrounded by the Jewish majority, and never sort of saw with my eyes somebody who was not a part of the Jewish majority. And then 20 years ago, we moved to live in the Galilee, and suddenly here I was, a member of a minority, because in the Galilee, most of the residents are Arabs. And suddenly it sort of hit me, this reality in which there's this sizable minority, which at least by law is completely equal, but in fact, there are glitches here and there. And then there's this basic difference, which is the law of return and the definition of the state and so on, which even if all the glitches are solved, even if there is no discrimination, acceptance to jobs and admittance to universities and so on and so forth, there is still that basic difference between those two kind of population groups. And it's really sort of sad that the fulfillment of our 2,000-year-old dream to build an independent Jewish state, if you want to sort of go by the Zionist narrative, involves to some extent the creation of this minority that is not able to fulfill that national aspiration. Now, having said that, this week, the Jewish People's Policy Institute published this survey showing that the last year, at the same time that we had this sorry story of the 3 elections, the political moves somehow caused the fact that the number of Israeli Arabs who now define themselves as Israeli, either Israeli, end of story, or Israeli Arabs, has grown a lot. And the number of these people defining themselves as Palestinians is greatly reduced. So, so I'm wondering whether that's a pragmatic change, whether that's something sort of kind of hopeful, in that we're managing to create something that is Israeli as opposed to Jewish here in Israel, and whether that trend will move someplace that is a little more optimistic, for me at least.
Yeah, I want to park for a second a whole other question that raises, which is the weirdness for American Jews or for non-Israeli Jews outside of Israel, for when there actually become equal rights under the law and equal rights in practice for Israeli Arabs, American Jews' own position actually becomes more precarious. So we can park that for a second. That's one of A.B. Yehoshua's historical arguments about the weird status that American Jews have. But I guess Tomer, in some ways my resistance to the reading that you're offering of kind of contrasting these birth documents as being measures of themselves is that both of them feel to me dishonest. The American project that describes itself in universalistic terms, you acknowledged in your reading, was meant for white landowning men. The 1619 project that the New York Times has been doing over the past year or two, documenting the extent to which the slave trade was an essential vehicle of the construction of this project. And so on one hand, America talks about itself as building a universal ideal for all of its citizens, but has never actually done that. And Israel's imagination of itself as designed particularly for the national needs of the Jewish people, just after a while, when it's a minority community envisioning its own future, I'm with you. That's my Zionism. I'm there for you in 1948. I'm there for you in 1967. But at a certain point, when you're a global superpower, when you actually have the majority and the minority there. The insistence on the covenantal document being rooted in the basic legitimacy of your own story, at a certain point, it's why do we want to keep building that project? And don't the voices of the Zionist dissenters from the late 1940s who wanted the Jewish people to be building a more universalistic and utopian ideal, who wanted it to look more like, 1776, that starts to become a critique that feels much more deep. So what does it do to keep holding on to the founding story as opposed to doing the corrective work of the present?
Well, I mean, thanks, Yehuda. I'll say this is a very big question, and disregarding the very fact that 1776 is terribly early for people to actually produce a utopia, and the United States was the first democracy or liberal democracy, modern, etc., which is a fantastic achievement in itself. And I mean, I think knowing history, we should acknowledge that processes take time and ideals take time to be brought to fruition. But putting all that aside, I think it's terribly important to remember our founding principles and to hold on to that, because that gives us the leverage to demand from ourselves today to live up to certain principles. I mean, yes, I know that neither Ben-Gurion nor George Washington lived up to all the principles they read out loud or signed or whatever. That's true, but that was because they, as any person, have their own deficiencies and certain weaknesses. But having those ideals beside us creates the demand for us to fill them and look at countries that don't have these ideals, right? It's not like that people in the Soviet Union, in Russia, can say to Putin today, what are you doing? This is not us. This is not what we dreamed about. This is not what our founding fathers wanted. They can't say that, right? Because there's no structure there that demands something else. So I think it's terribly important that we have that, and that we can have that yardstick to compare ourselves to again and again, and to demand more out of us, to even to guilt shame ourselves into acting better, right? And indeed, turning to the second part of what you said, I am, as a Zionist and as a person who believes that the Jews do have a right to be a majority in their own nation state and to chart out their own future and to self-express and self-describe themselves by themselves. I totally believe this is truly legitimate. As such a person, I am frightened by a prospect in the future that will demand of me holding on to other moral imperatives also, to let go of that dream and say, this has failed, and now we need to simply have a citizen-based community that doesn't take into account nationalities, that we will have a binational state or simply a democracy like France or whatever, because we have for too long not come to an egalitarian equitist society, and we have the West Bank controlled by the military, and it simply can't go on. I mean, I'm afraid of the moment that I will have to let go of Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky's vision and understand that there's no choice to be a moral Jew and to be both a moral Jew and a national Jew. We need to make a choice.
And I assume that neither of you at that place, and I'm curious for Sigalit, for you to, especially that last piece of either what's that threshold or what's your own state of relationship to that founding narrative as a continued motivator for the work that you want to do towards building a more equitable Israel.
Well, I think, first of all, there's a pragmatic issue that's related to our hanging on to the Declaration of Independence, which is that it's widely accepted. And I think Israeli society currently is so fragmented along so many fault lines that the discussion to try to frame something that would be somewhat as widely accepted as the Declaration of Independence would just either fail dramatically or just tear the society apart. So there's something sort of safe and comforting in the fact that we can hang on to that. You know, it was there at our birthplace, and we just continue along with that, and we don't have to talk about it too much. I mean, and look at what the nation-state law started up in the public sphere. The Declaration of Independence also is somewhat vaguely stated, and I think that's very wise. When you want to frame something that will last for a long time, then you try to frame it kind of vaguely, just like the Torah is sort of, you know, lets you have different interpretations of things to a certain extent, not to that extent, but to a certain extent, all the Declaration of Independence does that. It's not framed as this is halacha. It's more sort of wide-ranging ideals, and in that sense, it lends itself more easily to being a sort of a vision document and less of a sort of a blueprint for what's supposed to happen. Of course, you read this and you see the places where it's missing bits of history, the places where it's blatantly telling an incorrect story. You realize that there are motives there, and perhaps we would have written it differently today. I wish that we have a chance to reach a place where we will be able to sit in mixed groups, circles of Israeli citizens, you know, an Arab and a Haredi person, and a you know, and a Chiloni, a secular Jew, and so on, and sort of rewrite our founding document. I don't see where we can do that anytime soon. So as long as this is what we have, this is what we have.
It's like, imagine if the Jewish people today had to kind of crowdsource the Ten Commandments. So you have a version of your founding story that is what you have. And I'm reminded of Robert Cover's Nomos, a Narrative, and the need for overarching stories that we tell about ourselves, and then simultaneously the need for legal, political, and other infrastructure that actually turns those big stories that we tell about ourselves into the way in which we can actually order our world. Last question, I'll ask both of you, kind of a lightning round. A little personal, but maybe tell us the name of somebody who you're remembering this year on Yom HaZikaron, or you were remembering this year on Yom HaZikaron, and then maybe tell us something that you're proud of as you celebrated this year's Yom HaAtzmaut.
Proud of ourselves, or proud of because of the state?
Maybe proud because of the state of Israel.
Sigalin, do you want to begin?
Okay, I'll begin with Yom HaZikaron. 20-something years ago, there was a terrible accident where two choppers crashed into each other on the northern border, and 73 soldiers were killed. One of them, his name was Avi Ofner, and his parents, after grieving, got up from the Shiva and said, "We're continuing to live. We choose not to die from within." And they decided to start a project, which I've been joining every year for the past 15 years or so, which is that they organize a huge hike on the Israel Trail from Eilat in the south to Sha'ar Yashuv in the north, a place where the copters crashed. 2 months of hiking, to which all people from Israeli society are invited, Jews and Arabs, secular and religious. And it's just a chance to hike and walk and meet and discuss and argue and fight and make friends and so on. And it's just an example for me how these people from the ashes managed to create this incredible, incredible project that has touched the lives of tens of thousands of people. And every year when we reach Sha'ar Yashuv, they tell the story of Avi, the soldier who I never met, but it kind of feels like I already know him because I've heard all these stories about how he was as a kid. And that's one of the people who I think of on Yom HaZikaron.
Tomer?
I have to say, I'm fortunate enough not to know anybody personally who has died in one of the wars or the terrorist attacks. So I really don't have anyone specific. I'm just sad in a general way. And if I want to be proud of something, I mean, I've been watching terribly closely the last year's rounds and rounds of elections. And what I want to acknowledge and say I'm proud of is the amount of Israeli people's involvement and engagement in politics. I mean, we've had the percentages, the voting percentages in each elections only rise, right? And people, I mean, experts were concerned whether people would just give up and just, stay home and not vote. It's a holiday anyway, they can go to the beach and use it as a vacation, but that didn't happen. People actually went more and more each election cycle, and I'm pretty proud of it, and I hope that doesn't change. Really, also concerning the government that is going to form, which is a very big disappointment for many people, of course, on the left, especially.
Well, this year, as many years, I think about my cousin Anna Orgel, who was killed in a bus bombing in 2003 in Jerusalem. And what I'm proud of this year, especially, is actually, if I may say, both of you. It's incredible to know and to work with scholars of tremendous intellect and moral fiber who are proud Israelis who work on a day-to-day basis in your private and in your professional lives towards the moral and political improvement of the state of Israel and Israeli society. So with that, thank you all for listening to our show this week, and special thanks to my friends and my guests, Sigali Dur and Tomer Persico. Identity Crisis is a product of the Shalom Hartman Institute. It was produced and edited this week by David Zvi Kalman. Our managing producer is Dan Friedman, with music provided by So-Called. To learn more about the Shalom Hartman Institute, visit us online, shalomhartman.org. We want to know what you think about the show, and you can write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. You can subscribe to our show in the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, SoundCloud, and everywhere else podcasts are available. See you next week. Stay safe and healthy.